Well, there you are. Pull that blanket up and settle in. Get yourself comfortable now. There's no rush. It's a good night to just be still for a while. The world's still out there doing whatever it does. But that's got nothing to do with you right now. You've done enough today. More than enough, I'd wager. So let's just sit together a spell and let the evening do its thing. I've got the window cracked open a little tonight, just an inch or two, enough to let the evening in without making any grand commitment about it. There's a quality to the air this time of year that I find difficult to name exactly. Something green, something just slightly damp, like the ground has been patient all winter and has finally decided it's allowed to say so. The evenings are staying light longer now. There's still a faint color in the west when I open the window at this hour. Not quite dark yet, the sky going from blue to a kind of gray-blue to nothing in particular. I always like this time of year for the evenings. The evenings earn themselves in spring in a way they don't in other seasons. Spring has a habit of arriving whether you were ready for it or not. I've noticed this over the years. You spend most of March convincing yourself it's still winter. The days are technically getting longer. Things are technically warming up. But you're not quite ready to stop hunching your shoulders against the cold, because the cold has been the expectation for so long that you've forgotten you're allowed to update your expectation. And then one evening you open the window on instinct, and the air just comes in, soft, not urgent about anything, and you realize the season changed while you were still dressed for the old one. There's something about that moment, the moment you realize the season shifted without waiting for your permission, that I find genuinely settling. The world has its own schedule, and it keeps it, and there's a kind of rest in that. Things proceed according to something larger than any of us. The light returns, the ground softens. The frogs came back last week for the first time since fall. I heard them out in the direction of the creek just getting started, practicing, working out the arrangements for another year as if they'd never stopped. I've got chamomile tonight. Made it a little strong, I think. There's someone who used to tell me I always made it too strong. She was probably right about that. She was usually right about the small domestic things, which is not nothing. The small things add up and become the texture of a life. Now, if you find yourself coming back here most evenings, there's a small button somewhere on this page that makes that official. I'm told that's how this works, and I find the whole arrangement quietly charming. And if you're still awake enough, tell me where you're listening from tonight. I find myself genuinely curious about that. There's something I like about imagining all these different places, all these different kinds of darkness, all these people settling in at different hours. I've got a book with me this evening, one that's been on my shelf longer than I'm entirely comfortable admitting. I'd read parts of it years ago, enough to feel, in the easy way you do with books you half know, that I'd essentially read the whole thing, which is, of course, a form of self-deception that the author himself would have something sharp to say about. The man's name is Bertrand Russell. He was a British philosopher and mathematician, and, depending on the year and the topic, something of a general irritant to anyone who preferred comfortable ideas to honest ones. He was born in 1872 and died in 1970, which means he had nearly a century to watch what human beings do to themselves and each other, and he had opinions about it, quite detailed ones, set down with the kind of cool precision you get from a man who decided long ago that being liked was considerably less important than being accurate. The book is called The Conquest of Happiness. He wrote it in 1930, when he was in his late 50s, a time of life when a man has enough behind him to say things plainly without needing to protect himself from the implications. The title has always struck me as slightly martial for what turns out to be a gentle book. Conquest. As if happiness were a territory to be taken by force, with maps and strategy and some acceptable loss along the way. I think he chose the word deliberately. His point is that happiness doesn't simply arrive on its own. You have to arrange yourself correctly in relation to the world in order to receive it. And most people have arranged themselves incorrectly, and the misarrangement is fixable if you're willing to look at it clearly.
The book has two halves. The first is a catalog of the causes of unhappiness, the particular, almost predictable ways that people make themselves miserable without quite intending to. The second half is what he calls the causes of happiness, the things that actually work in his observation and experience. Tonight, we'll move through both. I'll tell you where I think he's right, and where I think he made things sound more straightforward than they turned out to be in practice. I want to be fair to him. He was a genius, and he was also the sort of person who arrived at clarity somewhat tidily, which makes you occasionally wonder how many of his ideas he genuinely lived, versus how many he thought his way to on a quiet afternoon with a good view. But it's a warm spring evening. The window is open. I'll try to be charitable. Let's start near the beginning. Russell spends considerable time early in the book on the subject of boredom. Not passing time on it, real time, the kind of attention you'd give to something you believe genuinely matters. He treats boredom as one of the central problems of modern life, which, when you first encounter it, reads as slightly eccentric. Poverty is a problem of modern life. Illness is a problem. Injustice, cruelty, loneliness, these are things that make people miserable in ways that obviously warrant serious attention. Boredom sounds like something that belongs in a more comfortable conversation, a complaint from people with the luxury of having nothing worse to discuss. But follow his reasoning. His argument is that people have lost the capacity to tolerate stillness. Not recently, by his reckoning. The process had been underway for some time, accelerating with the general pace of modern life. Something had shifted in how people related to quiet, to waiting, to the unmeasured moment with no particular purpose attached to it. The capacity for genuine stillness, for being present in a moment without demanding that the moment immediately deliver something, teach you something, give you something to react to, had become genuinely rare. And in the place of that capacity, something else had moved in. An addiction to excitement, not happiness, excitement. The two of which are not only different things, but may, in the end, be opposing ones. Here's how he puts it. I want to read this slowly. A generation that cannot endure boredom will be a generation of little men, of men unduly divorced from the slow processes of nature, of men in whom every vital impulse slowly withers, as though they were cut flowers in a vase. Cut flowers in a vase. He was writing this in 1930, which means he saw it coming about 90 years before most people began treating it as a crisis worth naming. The image stays with me. Cut flowers. They're bright, and they're arranged, and they're present in the room. They look very much alive. But something essential has been severed. The connection to the soil, to the roots, to the slow processes that make genuine growth possible. And the brightness they display is borrowed time, not grown. It will last a little while. And then it won't. I remember boredom from childhood, not with particular fondness. Boredom, when you're young, has an almost physical discomfort to it, a restlessness that seems to vibrate in the limbs and make the afternoon feel unreasonably long. But there were long summer days with nothing scheduled, nothing organized, nothing expected of you except that you not be inside. Car trips with nothing to look at but fence posts. Saturday mornings before anything had opened. And what happened in those gaps? If you sat with them long enough, if you stopped fighting the emptiness and simply allowed it to be what it was something I couldn't have named at the time but can name now. A kind of mental foraging. The mind, given nothing urgent to react to, turns inward and starts producing things on its own. Connections, images, half-formed thoughts that don't have any immediate use, that won't impress anyone or improve any outcome, but that are the raw material of something worth having. The slow thoughts, the ones that don't arrive in 5 minutes, the ones that need an afternoon with nothing competing for them. There are things I understood about my own work, about what I was actually good at, about the kinds of problems I found genuinely interesting versus the kinds I took on for other reasons that only arrived in those unmeasured hours, not at a desk with a deadline, not in a meeting, in the gaps, in the long mornings before I'd committed to anything, in the drives when I let the mind go where it wanted to go. Russell calls this being divorced from the slow processes of nature. That's exactly the phrase. The slow processes, the ones that require more time than we're currently in the habit of giving them. I'm not sure those gaps are structurally available in the same way anymore. There's always something close at hand ready to fill any silence that lasts more than 40 seconds, and the silence never has a chance to say what silence says when you give it room. I want to be careful here. I've lived long enough to hear several generations of people warn that the latest technology is ruining attention spans, and they've been wrong often enough that I try not to join the complaint without thinking first. The printing press was supposed to ruin something important. Radio was going to do it. Television would finish the job. Each generation finds its candidate for the thing that finally broke what the previous thing only bent, and they are usually overstating the case. But Russell's observation has a specific quality I find difficult to dismiss. He's not talking about distraction. He's talking about a structural capacity, the willingness to be in a moment that isn't delivering anything yet, to wait without demanding. And that capacity is the precondition for almost everything worth doing that takes longer than a week. A long book requires it. A real friendship, the kind that deepens over years, requires it. A skill that won't announce itself until you've been at it long enough that you've stopped wondering when it will arrive requires it. The slow processes. The opposite of boredom, in Russell's view, isn't excitement. It's interest. Deep, patient, quietly sustained interest in something outside yourself. Excitement is available everywhere and costs nothing and leaves no lasting deposit. Interest accumulates. Interest, given enough years, changes who you are. He'll come back to that idea. So will I. There's one more thing about boredom that I want to say before we move on, because I think it's the most practically useful part of Russell's argument. He's not asking you to become a monk. He's not asking you to give up your phone or your entertainments or the things you legitimately enjoy. He's asking you to notice whether you've lost the capacity to be still or whether you simply choose not to exercise it most of the time. Those are different conditions with different remedies. The capacity can be rebuilt if it's been let go of. It requires, like most things that have been let go of, a period of discomfort before it becomes comfortable again. The first 20 minutes of doing nothing in particular feel intolerable if you haven't done it in years. The mind throws up objections, produces urgency from nothing, insists that you're wasting time that could be spent on something. All of this is the machinery of excitement addiction doing what it does when it's asked to be quiet. If you stay with it, if you let the restlessness run itself out, something does eventually come. It takes longer than 40 seconds, but it comes. Russell would call that the beginning of zest. I'd call it the beginning of the life you were going to have once you stopped filling all the space. There's a chapter on envy that I'd recommend to almost anyone, not because it's comfortable reading, it isn't, but because Russell identifies something true about it that most discussions of the subject manage to miss. He calls envy the most corrosive of the unhappy emotions. Not anger. Anger's at least honest, at least acknowledges itself, has a chance of running its course. Not fear. Fear can be appropriate, can do its work and pass. Not even grief, which is real and necessary, and changes its character over time. Envy sits quietly and poisons from the inside over a long period, and the particular trouble with it, the thing Russell pins down with some precision, is that it is the emotion we are least willing to name accurately in ourselves. Anger you can recognize. Grief arrives with appropriate weight. Envy almost always presents in disguise. In my experience, it usually comes dressed as discernment, or standards, or a principled critical faculty that simply notices clearly and accurately when things and people fall short of what they ought to be. You tell yourself you have high expectations because you've earned them. You tell yourself the thing that irritates you really is inferior. You tell yourself the person who has what you want doesn't appreciate it properly, or didn't earn it fairly, or would be improved by a replacement you could name. You do not, if you can help it, sit down with the simpler version. I want what that person has, and watching them have it makes me unhappy. That would be undignified. So, you find a more flattering name for the feeling, and you carry it under that name for years, and it does its work the whole time. Here's how Russell describes what's happening underneath. Envy consists in seeing things never in themselves, but only in their relations. If you desire glory, you may envy Napoleon. But Napoleon envied Caesar, and Caesar envied Alexander, and Alexander, I dare say, envied Hercules, who never existed. I have always liked that last part. Alexander envied Hercules, who never existed. The comparison that cannot be satisfied, not because the standard is too high, but because the standard is imaginary. The ideal assembled from the most impressive parts of people who also had unimpressive parts, edited for display, stripped of complications, polished into something that no actual life has ever contained. I had a version of envy in my 40s that I did not recognize as envy for the better part of a decade. I thought it was professional discernment. There was a man I knew in those years, I won't describe him beyond that, who moved through the world with a quality of ease that I found, I now understand, genuinely intolerable. Work came to him. Opportunities arrived without visible effort. The recognition I felt I was working toward seemed to accumulate around him simply as a consequence of existing in the right room. He was not a bad person. He was not a fraud. He was simply at ease in a way I was not,
and things came to him accordingly. I built a case against him that I maintained with real dedication over several years. His work was less careful than mine. He was better at the presentation of things than at the substance of things. The people who recognized him were not equipped to distinguish surface from depth. I had evidence. I kept adding to it. I did not once in those years, sit down with the honest version. I wanted what he had. I wanted the ease of it, the way the world seemed to make room for him naturally, where I felt I was always requesting permission. That was the truth. It took me until my early 50s to say it plainly, to myself, where no one was watching. The moment I named it correctly, envy. Just that, not standards, not discernment. Something shifted, not immediately and not completely. But the thing lost its operational force once it had an accurate name. Unnamed, it had been running the whole department from a back room, organizing my perceptions around its own interests without ever declaring what those interests were. Named, it became just a feeling. One I recognized, one I could observe without having to act on, or maintain evidence for, or build a narrative around. There's something else worth saying about envy that Russell doesn't quite get to explicitly, but that I've found true in practice. The case I'd built against that man, the years of accumulated evidence for his unworthiness, had a strange quality once the envy was named. It didn't just feel less necessary. It felt, looking back at it, almost embarrassing in its detail. All that careful attention, all that evidence gathering. For years, I had been paying close attention to a person I claimed not to particularly respect, cataloging his every shortcoming, maintaining a running record of where he fell short, which is not, when you set it down plainly, how you spend time on people you genuinely don't care about. Envy is, in its way, a form of devotion, misdirected and painful and dressed up in other clothes, but devotion. You spend years on someone, Russell would say, spend that time on something outside yourself instead. He is, as I said, not wrong about the direction. Russell's proposed remedy is what he returns to throughout the book. Turn the attention outward, genuinely, toward the thing itself, rather than toward your position in relation to others. When you are honestly interested in something for what it is, not for how it compares to what someone else has, the machinery of comparison has nothing to grip. The garden doesn't know what your neighbor's garden looks like. The book doesn't care what shelf it's on. That is easier to prescribe than to practice, but the direction is right. There is a section of this book that I have underlined in 3 separate readings over 30-odd years, which is about as reliable an endorsement as I know how to give. Russell calls it the fear of public opinion. He means the quiet way people arrange their lives around what others might think. Not dramatically. Nobody sits down and says, I will now organize my choices according to my imagined sense of what the people around me would approve of. It accumulates in small moments. The thing you chose not to say, the direction you didn't take because you weren't sure how it would land, the interest you kept to yourself, the opinion you didn't state, the version of yourself you folded away because you couldn't predict how it would be received. He makes the observation that most people spend a considerable portion of their lives doing this without quite noticing that's what they're doing. There is a kind of ambient monitoring that runs in the background of most decisions, a continuous, low-level awareness of how one appears, whether one is being understood correctly, whether one is coming across as the kind of person one intends to be understood as.
It is rarely named. It is rarely examined. But it is there, doing its quiet work. And then he says something I find quietly devastating. A man who has decided to do something foolish will first convince himself that it is wise. The fear of public opinion has the same effect. A man who is afraid of public opinion will first convince himself that what public opinion forbids is really wicked. That is the mechanism. Not simply that we avoid what others disapprove of, we go further. We absorb the disapproval and convert it into conviction. We come to believe we don't want the thing, or that the thing is genuinely wrong, when the truth is we've been told we shouldn't want it long enough that we've stopped questioning the distinction. The cage becomes the argument against leaving. I remember a specific version of the monitoring from my 30s. I had strong opinions about a number of things that I expressed in those years, only in rooms where I was confident the opinions would be well received. In other rooms, I was more careful. I adjusted. I waited to see which way the conversation was going. And I told myself this was social intelligence. This was knowing when to speak. But the test is whether you can say what you actually think when it matters, with the people who matter, whether you can say the true thing in the room where it's less welcome. And in those years, I often couldn't. Not because I was a coward exactly. I could be direct enough about other things, but the opinions I held most closely, the ones I actually cared about most, were the ones I guarded most carefully, which is precisely backwards. The things most worth saying are the ones most worth risking. At some point in my 60s, I can't tell you the year, it didn't arrive with any ceremony, the monitoring thinned out. The ambient concern for how I was appearing, the low-level management of impression, it gradually stopped finding things to do. I didn't decide this. It more receded on its own, the way a persistent background sound recedes until you notice one afternoon that you haven't heard it in weeks. I had spent considerable energy earlier in life on the project of being correctly understood, not pathologically, just the ordinary work of being understood as the kind of person you'd like to be understood as, the careful selection of what you share and when and with whom, the slight adjustment of expressed opinions depending on who was in the room, the brief internal audit before saying what you actually thought, to verify it wouldn't land badly. It doesn't feel like dishonesty from the inside. It feels like social competence, like knowing the room, like the mature understanding that you don't say every thought aloud to every person at every moment. And some of that is simply true. Some of that is just appropriate. But there is a difference between discretion and the sustained management of a reputation, and I had drifted, over the years, into the second one more than I'd noticed. When it stopped mattering, when I genuinely stopped needing the image actively managed, the energy that had gone into that project went somewhere else, into work done for the sake of the work, into conversations where I was actually present rather than present and monitoring, into mornings that had the quality of belonging to me rather than of being a performance for an audience I wasn't sure was watching. Russell believes you can arrive at this earlier than most people do if you understand what's happening. I believe him in principle. In practice, I suspect it has to be outgrown more than decided. You need enough accumulated evidence that the feared thing happened and you survived it. That evidence takes time. You can't manufacture it. But you can begin noticing the monitoring while it's running. And noticing, as I keep finding, is where everything starts. I'd add one practical observation to Russell's analysis, which is this.
The monitoring tends to thin out naturally when you spend more time with people who don't require it. There are people in whose company the calibration simply doesn't seem necessary. People who are clearly not going to judge you for saying what you actually think, who are interested in what you actually think, rather than in what they'd prefer you to think, who have their own opinions and would rather have yours in honest exchange than have you managing yourself carefully for their comfort. Time with those people is not just pleasant, it is quietly educational. It reminds the nervous system that the monitoring isn't always required, that most of it was, in fact, optional. That is perhaps the most useful thing I can tell you about fear of public opinion. Find the rooms where it isn't necessary and spend more time in them. The habit, over enough years, may generalize. Partway through the book, somewhere in the turn from the causes of unhappiness toward the causes of happiness, Russell introduces a word that I keep returning to. He uses it as the name for the essential quality of the happy person, the thing underneath everything else, the root from which the other things grow. The word is zest, not joy. Joy is intermittent and weather-dependent, not something you can produce reliably on demand. Not contentment. Contentment is too passive, too much the mood of a man who has stopped being curious about much of anything, not even peace, though peace may be downstream of it. Zest, by which he means genuine appetite, honest curiosity, the capacity to find something outside yourself interesting for no reason other than that it's there and it's interesting. He writes about it as the natural state, which he believes it is in children before the various pressures of growing up do what they do to it, and as if the whole project of becoming a happier adult is essentially about not losing it or finding your way back when you've noticed it's gone quiet. Here's how he puts it. The secret of happiness is this: let your interests be as wide as possible, and let your reactions to the things and persons that interest you be as far as possible friendly rather than hostile. Wide interests, friendly reactions. 2 sentences, the whole formula. I find this both completely correct and mildly infuriating in the way that most true things are when you distill them too cleanly. The truth of it is obvious. The living of it is the work of a lifetime. And when Russell writes it with such apparent ease, you have to resist the urge to ask him how, specifically, he managed the friendly reactions part during his 3 marriages and several spectacular public controversies, all of which suggest the formula was considerably easier to write than to practice. But I don't want to be uncharitable. The observation is right. I knew a man, a neighbor of mine for about 12 years, who had this quality in precisely the sense Russell means. His name was Walter. He was interested in everything, not as a project he'd adopted for self-improvement purposes, genuinely, naturally, apparently effortlessly interested in whatever happened to be in front of him. He knew birds the way a person knows something they've loved for years, not as a list of names, but as a continuing acquaintance with individuals and habits. He'd glance toward a window during an ordinary conversation and say, without changing his tone, "There's one I haven't seen since March," and return to what we'd been talking about as if nothing had interrupted. He was interested in how engines worked and why they were built the way they were. In weather, not the forecast, the actual system of it, the way pressure moved across the region and changed the quality of the light. in what people did for work and why they'd ended up there, in history, in the particular history of small local things, in you specifically when you were in the room. He was not remarkable by any external measure, but he had that particular quality of genuine presence, of being actually there when he was there, curious about what was actually happening, rather than about what it might mean for him, and people wanted to be near him. Things seemed, generally, to go reasonably well for him. I used to think his ease was temperamental luck. I understand now that it was a practice, even if he'd never thought of it as one. He'd simply kept something that most people put down somewhere in their 20s, and then spend the rest of their lives faintly missing without being able to name it. Walter died about 4 years after he moved away from the neighborhood. Heart, fairly sudden from what I was told. I heard about it secondhand, weeks after it happened. I remember the specific quality of the feeling when I got the news. Not grief exactly, because we hadn't been in close contact in the years between. More a sense of something gone from the general atmosphere, something that had made the world warmer while it was there, and left a kind of gap in the temperature when it wasn't. I've thought about that gap more than seems proportionate. I think what I was feeling was something like that quality he had, the genuine, unself-conscious interest in everything, is genuinely rare, and the world has somewhat less of it now, and I don't know how to make more of it except by trying, imperfectly, with effort, to be a little more like that myself, which he never tried. He just was. That might be the highest compliment available for a life, that the world is measurably less interesting without it in it. The question I can't fully answer is whether that quality can be recovered by an act of will once it's been set down. Russell implies it can, that a person who notices the appetite thinning can deliberately expand their interests, turn toward new things, practice curiosity as a discipline until it becomes genuine. I believe this is partly true. I've done a version of it myself in flat years, with some results. The deliberate version carries a slight effort that the natural version doesn't. Whether that distinction matters in the long run, whether the practiced version eventually becomes genuine enough that the effort disappears, I honestly don't know. Russell would probably say that's close enough. Later in the book, Russell makes an argument that I consider the most useful thing in it. He gives it the name impersonal interests, by which he means the things you care about that don't depend on anyone else's behavior or on your own continuing success or on whether any particular outcome turns out the way you'd hoped. He means things that are simply there, available whenever you return to them, that ask nothing of you beyond attention and give back something steady in proportion. A subject you've been reading about for years, a garden, a craft you practice without expecting to become professional at it, the history of some corner of the world that nobody you know particularly cares about, but that you find endlessly worth knowing, the night sky, a long book you work through slowly enough that it becomes part of the furniture of a whole season. He distinguishes these carefully from ambition and from social engagement, both fine things in their proper place, but both contingent in ways that matter. Ambition depends on success, and success is unreliable and eventually becomes unavailable regardless of effort. Social engagement depends on other people, and other people are, as Russell observes with his characteristic dryness, not always cooperative. They move away. They change. They disappoint you, and then forgive you, and then disappoint you again. And the whole thing is rich and real and fundamentally out of your control.
The impersonal interest doesn't depend on any of that. It doesn't need outcomes. It's not going to disappoint you or fail to return your investment or stop being interesting in the particular way it's been interesting for 20 years. It just continues to be what it is, quietly there, whenever you come back to it.
Here's how he puts it.
The man who has no interest in things outside himself cannot find in later years the same comfort as the man who has developed wide and vivid interests. He will find that he has nothing to fall back on, nothing to sustain him in adversity, nothing to give him the sense of a life richer than personal fortune.
Nothing to fall back on.
I've watched this over the years. Over enough time, you get to watch it in people you've known, if you've been paying attention. And the difference between the people who arrive at later life with something to fall back on and those who don't is not subtle. The people I've known who aged with the most equanimity didn't all share the same circumstances. Some had good health, some didn't. Some had family close by. Some were mostly alone. Some had enough money to make the practical anxieties smaller. Some were managing carefully. The variable that seemed to matter most, the one that appeared consistently among the people with that quality of settledness, was exactly what Russell describes. Something outside themselves that they'd kept faith with over decades. Something that didn't require them to be young or useful or recognized in order to be available. I knew a woman, a neighbor of a friend, someone I saw occasionally over about 15 years, who had spent most of her adult life interested in the history of a particular region of the country, not her own region, a place she'd become interested in decades earlier for reasons she probably couldn't have fully explained even at the time. She had files. She'd traveled there more than once to walk the land and look at old records and talk to people who remembered things that were almost done being remembered by anyone. She knew its geography and its people and its complicated local past and the particular quality of the light there in different seasons, because she'd gone there in different seasons to see. Nobody she knew cared about this subject. It had produced nothing visible, no publication, no recognition, no demonstrable usefulness to anyone. It was simply a thing she was interested in, had been interested in for decades, and that was completely available to her at 83. Still interesting, still vivid, still hers in all its particular detail, when many other things had become harder to hold. I should say, in the interest of honesty, that I have my own version of this, a thing I've kept faith with for longer than I can now easily track. It has no useful purpose in the practical sense. Nobody needs it from me. It doesn't improve my standing with anyone. It has produced nothing that could be put in a list of accomplishments. I won't describe it beyond that, because the thing itself matters less than the principle Russell is pointing at. What I notice about it is this. On the days when other things haven't gone particularly well, when work was frustrating, or a conversation went badly, or the general friction of being alive in the world was higher than usual, it is still there, unaffected by any of that, interested in itself in exactly the proportion it was yesterday. That steadiness is not nothing. That steadiness over years has become something I rely on without quite having decided to. And when I haven't engaged with it for a while, something gets slightly colder. Something gets slightly more contracted. The thing that's steady is also, it turns out, the thing that keeps other things from contracting. That is what Russell means by a life richer than personal fortune. Not the achievements, the interests, the things you went back to, quietly, for years, that became part of how you understand the world. You probably have some version of this, something you return to not because it's useful, not because anyone is watching, just because it means something to you in a way that doesn't require justification. It might feel modest. It might not look from outside like something that would matter much in the end. But the modest, impersonal interest, faithfully maintained, doesn't expire. It just keeps being what it is. And that turns out to be worth more than it looks. At the end of the book, Russell draws a portrait, not a prescription, not a self-improvement program, just a description of the person he's been building toward through the whole book, the happy man. He's been working up to this throughout, and when he arrives, it's quieter than you might expect from a book called The Conquest of Happiness. There's no dramatic transformation, no epiphany at the summit, just a man who has, over time, arranged himself correctly in relation to the world, and lives accordingly in a world that responds to him with some warmth. I want to read this passage whole. It's short. I want to read it and then sit with it. The happy man is the man who lives objectively, who has free affections and wide interests, who secures his happiness through these interests and affections, and through the fact that they, in turn, make him an object of interest and affection to many others. Lives objectively, free affections, wide interests. The phrase I keep returning to is free affections, not calculated affections, not warmth extended in proportion to the expected return, not the affection of a man who has learned from hard experience to love carefully, choosing carefully, keeping something in reserve, managing his exposure so the loss won't be catastrophic when things go badly. Free affections, given without running the arithmetic first. I've known people who loved strategically, not unkind people, not consciously calculating ones, people who had simply at some point decided that warmth was a resource that needed to be managed with care, that the wisdom of experience was to invest yourself in proportion to the likely return, that the lesson of having been hurt was to be more measured going forward, that this caution was maturity. What it produces over decades is a contracted life. The circle of warmth gets smaller and smaller because fewer and fewer people pass the analysis. The people who do get in feel on some level the conditionality of the warmth they're receiving. It has a different temperature than free affection, something administered about it, something being parceled out according to a ledger. You can sense it if you're paying close attention. I'll tell you something specific about the contracted version from years when I lived in it more than I'd prefer to admit. The monitoring doesn't just affect how you give warmth. It affects how you receive it. When you're managing your own output carefully, you become almost inevitably suspicious of unmanaged input. Someone is very warm toward you, freely, readily, without apparent calculation, and instead of simply receiving it, you find yourself wondering what's underneath it, what they want, what they're positioning for. Because you've been in the management business yourself, you can't quite believe that anyone else isn't. That is the worst part of it. Not that you give less, though you do, but that the warmth you do receive lands wrong, filtered through a skepticism that your own habits created. The cage, again, becoming the argument against leaving. The people I've known who loved most freely, who were simply glad when someone walked in the room, who gave their interest and warmth without calculating the return, who were curious about strangers as people with lives worth knowing,
Those people tended to live in a warmer world, not because the world became objectively warmer for them through good fortune, because they made it warmer consistently over years everywhere they went, and then lived in what they'd made. Russell's portrait of the happy man is a portrait of someone who has gotten out of that particular structure, not by becoming naive, by becoming genuinely interested in people, which is different from being credulous about them. You can be interested in someone and clear-eyed about them at the same time. The interest doesn't require you to be a fool. It just requires you to lead with curiosity rather than with risk assessment. That, over time, is what produces the warmth Russell describes, not an act of will, just the natural result of being the kind of person who finds people genuinely interesting. Russell's happy man is not exceptional. That's the most honest thing about this portrait. He hasn't achieved anything extraordinary. He's just a man who got interested in the world and let himself love without too much arithmetic, and in doing so became someone others wanted to be near, which made the world warmer, which made the interest and the love easier to sustain, which completed the circle. That's the whole thing. You can write it in a few sentences, as Russell did. You can spend a lifetime learning to live it, with uneven results. The trying is not nothing, and on a warm April evening with the window open and the air coming in soft, it doesn't seem like a hard direction to point yourself. I want to say one more thing about Russell's portrait, because I think there's something in it that gets missed if you read it too quickly. He says the happy man secures his happiness through his interests and affections and through the fact that they, in turn, make him an object of interest and affection to others. Through the fact that they, in turn, is the part worth sitting with. He's not describing a strategy. He's not saying, be warm toward people in order to receive warmth in return, as a technique. He's describing a natural consequence. The warm man is not warm because it works. He's warm because that's who he is. And it does work. The circle does complete itself. But the completion is incidental to the doing. You have to be genuinely interested in things and genuinely loving toward people. And then, as a natural result of that, the world will be warmer around you. If you try to engineer the result without the genuine thing, you get the managed version. And the managed version doesn't complete the circle. It just gives you a smaller cage with better furniture. Russell understood this. He'd watched enough people to know the difference between the thing and the performance of the thing. The portrait he draws is of someone who isn't trying to be happy. He's just someone who has pointed himself in the right direction and kept walking outward with some generosity and patience for the slow things. That's Bertrand Russell, The Conquest of Happiness, 1930. A man who had most of a century to watch what human beings do to themselves and who arrived at an answer that is simple without being easy. Stop pointing yourself at yourself so much. Let your interests be wide and vivid. Love without too much arithmetic. Have something to fall back on that doesn't require anything to be going right. I've been testing these ideas for a long time. Some of them I arrived at on my own, later than I might have if I'd read more carefully when I was younger. Some I read in Russell and recognized something I'd been circling for years without knowing it. That's what the good books do, I find. They don't tell you things you've never considered. They tell you things you've been thinking without quite knowing it. And the recognition has its own quality, a kind of rest.
like setting down something you'd forgotten you were carrying. The copy on my shelf has been moved and found again more times than I can account for over 30-odd years. I take that as its own kind of recommendation. The books you don't quite finish but can't give away are usually the ones that have become part of the furniture of your thinking without your arranging it. You don't need to read them through again from the beginning. You just need to know they're there, available whenever you need them. I'll put it back tonight in approximately the right place on the shelf. The window is still open a crack. There's a sound from the direction of the creek. The frogs, still at it, still working out whatever arrangement they've been working out since mid-April. The spring air is doing what it does at this hour, unhurried, not asking anything of anyone in particular. There's no hurry. No hurry at all. Somewhere out there, Russell's book is sitting on a lot of shelves, in a lot of different houses, in a lot of different countries, in a few different languages. It's been there since 1930. It'll be there a while longer. The things worth saying tend to last. That's not because the world improves at reading them. It's because the things worth saying are generally about the things that don't change. Human beings haven't fundamentally changed since 1930. We still want the same things, fear the same things, deceive ourselves in the same directions. The specific machinery changes. The underlying human has not. That's either discouraging or comforting, depending on the evening. Tonight, I'll call it comforting. And I suppose that's the thing about it, really. A man spent most of a long life thinking carefully about happiness, and the answer he arrived at was approximately this: be interested in things, be loving without too much arithmetic, be at peace with how small you are in the general arrangement of everything, not complicated. Not easy. But there's something settling about the simplicity of it at this hour. Russell would approve of this hour, I think. Nothing to conquer, nowhere to be, just the evening doing what evenings do, and the slow processes working quietly in the dark the way they always have. The night has that quality, if you let it. Everything that was urgent an hour ago is the same size it always was, which is to say, small enough not to require anything from you tonight. You have things that interest you. You have people you're glad exist. The window is still open. The air is still coming in soft and unhurried. Nothing needs resolving tonight. Let the rest just fade into the next quiet thing. The night has a way of taking care of the rest. Well, that's about all from me tonight. You just close your eyes now. Don't worry about what's coming tomorrow. It'll sort itself out, same as it always does. You did good today. Sweet dreams now. I'll be right here.